What's up guys, and welcome to the video on quadratic equations. Let's do it. So first of all, let's start with what is a quadratic equation or quadratic function. So quadratic equation is an equation where the highest exponent is 2. So for example, y equals x squared is a quadratic equation. So is y equals x squared plus 7, and y equals 2x squared plus 3x minus 4. Now let's talk about what a quadratic function looks like when it's graphed, and it takes on the shape of what's called a parabola. So let's take this nice x and y coordinate plane here. A parabola is just simply, it goes up to the left and up to the right, and it forms this nice curved shape. So that is what any quadratic function will look like when graphed, or it could be inverted, it could be upside down, and that's usually when the first term is negative. Now let's talk about what it looks like when we have a vertical shift in a parabola, and also how you will change the function to represent that. So let's say we've got y equals x squared, the most basic of all quadratic functions. And if we want a vertical shift of 4, we are simply going to add 4 to the entire equation, and you see that the graph will shift up by 4 units. Conversely, if we subtract 4 from y equals x squared, it will relate to a downward shift of 4 units. Now let's talk about horizontal shifts. So a horizontal shift, we're going to start again with y equals x squared, and instead of where we added or subtracted a number on the outside of the function, essentially like to the end of the function, here we're going to add or subtract a number to x in particular, meaning that the number is also going to be affected by the exponent. So if we want a horizontal shift to the right of 4 units, we're actually going to subtract 4 within parentheses and square that entire piece, and that will lead to a shift to the right of 4 units. Now I know it's counterintuitive. You usually think that subtracting will be a shift to the negative, but in this case it's the opposite. And likewise, if we added 4 within the parentheses, it would constitute a shift to the left of 4 units. Now let's talk about how to widen or narrow the parabola. And this is we're really talking about vertical shifts and compressions, but it looks like widening or narrowing. So let's say we wanted to narrow this, or which is the same as a vertical stretch. We would multiply x squared by a number greater than 1. So in this case, we're going to multiply it by 3, and you'll see that it elongates the parabola, or kind of looks like it's compressing it. And likewise, if we multiply it by a number between 0 and 1, we are going to widen it or vertically compress it. So in this case, we're multiplying y equals x squared by 1/3, and you see that vertical compression. Now let's talk about how to solve a quadratic equation. And when we're solving a quadratic equation, really what we're doing is we're trying to find the roots of this quadratic function, meaning we are trying to find where this parabola, if at all, hits the x-axis. So what we're doing is we're setting our y value equals to 0, and we're seeing what values of x give us a 0 for y. So let's take this sample equation. We've got y equals x squared minus 4x plus 4. First, we're going to set it to 0, and then we're going to try and solve it by something called factoring. So let me walk you through the process of factoring. So we're always going to start with 2 open sets of parentheses, and we're going to try and fit the numbers and the variables inside that if multiplied out will give us our starting equation. So the way we figure out what goes in the first 2 spots of these parentheses is by looking at our primary term, which in this case is x squared. So you just think, what 2 numbers multiply against each other give us x squared? Well, of course, in this case it's x, so we go ahead and throw in an x in the first spot. Okay, now we got to figure out what goes in the second 2 spots of these parentheses, and to figure that out, we just look at the last number. And so the last number in this case is 4. So we think, what 2 numbers multiply against each other give us 4? Well, there's a few different options. We have 1, 4, we have 2 and 2, we have -1 and -4, and we have -2 and -2. So how do we figure out which one of these pairs of numbers is the numbers that we want? Now we look at the middle term. So the middle term is -4. So that's the limiting factor. We need two numbers that multiply to give us +4, but that also add to give us -4. So of these four sets of numbers, the only numbers that multiply to give us 4 and add together to give us -4 is -2 and -2. So those are our winners. So we plug those in. So we got x minus 2 times x minus 2. And in this case, since those repeat, it's simply x minus 2 squared. So what does that mean? If we look at what value for x will give us 0, it's simply 2, right? Because if we plug a 2 in there, we get 2 minus 2, which is 0 squared, which is, of course, 0. So for this function, our root is 2. Now I'm going to show you how to solve this quadratic equation using something called the quadratic formula. So this is a foolproof method in case you can't factor a quadratic equation. You can always use the quadratic formula and it's always going to work. So what is the quadratic formula? Well, first it's important to know what the different parts of this equation are that we need to know in order to plug into the quadratic formula. So we have an A and a B and a C, and these just relate to the coefficients of whatever quadratic formula you're dealing with. So A is whatever is multiplying your x squared, B is whatever is multiplying your x term, and C is whatever constant is just sort of hanging out there. So then once you know those pieces, you plug them into the following formula, and I highly recommend that you memorize this formula. I know it seems overwhelming, but it's really not so bad once you get in a little practice. So the quadratic formula is -b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So let's go ahead and color code our coefficients for this equation. So we got 1 as a, 4 as b, and or -4 as b, and then we got +4 at the end for our c value. So let's go ahead and plug all these values in, right? So we're getting that -4 in wherever we have a b, we've got the 1 in wherever we had an a, and the 4 in wherever we had a c. So we got negative, because again it's -b, -4 plus or minus b squared. Now b is actually -4. I've left off the negative because it doesn't really matter. When you square a negative, you're always going to get a positive. So it's 4 squared minus 4ac over 2a, or 2, in this case 2 times 1. So we go ahead and evaluate this. We get 4 plus or minus 16 minus 16 over 2. So that square root ends up being the square root of 0. So we're left with 4 over 2, or simply 2, which again gives us the same answer that we got the first time when we simply factored the quadratic equation. That's it for the video on quadratic equations. Let's get into some practice problems.